$5.86 and 16 cents. These aren't the prices of oil or stocks, but the cost of loading 1 ton of cargo onto a ship before and after a single invention. A 97% drop in price. This invention wasn't a complex mechanism, but an ordinary metal box. The revolution didn't happen at sea, but at the dock. It was there, amidst the chaos of loading, that almost half of all shipping costs were lost, making many goods unprofitable for global trade. This box created the world you live in. The phone in your pocket, the clothes on your back, the food on your table, all became accessible thanks to this price collapse. But behind this figure lies a story of struggle, brilliant insight, and destroyed professions. The real mystery isn't what happened, but why this obvious idea met such fierce resistance. This leads us to two mysteries. First, why did giant ports like New York, which controlled world trade, lose out first in this new race, committing economic suicide? And second, how did dockworker unions, so powerful they could paralyze the entire U.S. economy with a single strike, agree to a technology that was guaranteed to destroy their profession? The answers to these questions are key to understanding modern globalization. By the end of this film, you will have 6 such keys. They will allow you to unlock the code of the invisible system that governs the world economy today. And the first key lies in the world of unimaginable chaos that reigned in every port before it was swallowed by a simple iron box. How could it be that ships, designed to cross oceans, spent most of their lives idle at the dock? The problem wasn't with engines or weather, but with what was happening on shore. Port logs from the 1950s reveal a shocking fact. A transatlantic voyage, which took 10 days, could be preceded by up to 3 weeks of downtime in ports. This was dead time, when a multi-million-dollar asset brought in not a cent, but only generated losses. The reality was stark. The cost of loading and unloading accounted for up to 50% of all maritime transport costs. This wasn't just inefficiency, it was an economic catastrophe. Dead time acted like a dam on the river of capital. A ship full of goods was a powerful current, but the port turned it into a stagnant, unprofitable swamp. This system was locked from within by a force that benefited from every lost hour. If time is money, why did an entire industry tolerate this for decades, burning colossal resources? At first glance, the reason lay with people. Dock work was difficult and dangerous, and petty theft was considered normal. But the real reason wasn't individual workers, but their unions, which wielded almost absolute power. They dictated how many people had to work at each hold, prohibited the use of more efficient winches, and could stop work for the slightest reason. Any attempt by a ship owner to speed up the process was met with a strike, which cost dozens of times more than downtime. The union controlled not just people, but the very pace of time in the port. Union leaders in New York had power comparable to that of ministers. With a single call, they could halt trade across the entire U.S. East Coast. To break this system, an outside perspective, not one from within the maritime industry, was needed. Imagine you're a ship owner in 1950. How would you solve the problem of dead time? More people? The unions would welcome that. Larger bags? Dock workers would refuse to carry them. Improved winches? Sabotage and accidental breakdowns. All these ideas ran up against the power of the unions. Everyone was trying to optimize the process of loading individual pieces of cargo. But what if you changed the cargo itself? What if you stopped thinking about how to load and started thinking about how not to load individual bags and boxes at all? The conclusion was revolutionary. The system didn't need to be improved. It needed to be completely abolished. Replace thousands of small transfer operations with one large one. Has an idea ever come to your mind that completely changed the rules of the game in your work? The entire maritime industry, from engineers to company owners, had accepted port chaos as an inevitable evil. If the professionals couldn't see a solution, who could find one? Experts were indeed working on the problem, but their thinking was limited. They tried to improve crane designs or hold shapes. They were treating symptoms, not the disease. The solution came from a man who hated waiting in port more than anyone. For him, every hour of downtime wasn't an expense item in a report, but a personal loss of time and money. This man was not an admiral or an engineer, but a simple truck driver. The man who revolutionized the sea had never been a ship captain in his life. He came from the land. While the old salts looked at their ships, this man looked at his truck. And that changed everything. His name was Malcom McLean. He started his journey in 1934 with one used truck, and by the 1950s, he had built one of the largest transportation companies in the U.S. He was a practitioner, not a theoretician, a man who knew the cost of every minute of downtime. But his main asset wasn't his company. It was his obsession with efficiency. For him, port chaos wasn't an abstract problem, but a personal insult. In 1937, in a North Carolina port, young McLean sat in his cab for hours, watching his cotton slowly being unloaded, bale by bale. His irritation was almost physical. He felt time and money slipping through his fingers. His thought wasn't, how can they work faster? But damn it, why don't they just load my entire trailer onto the ship? The idea was ingenious. But between it and reality lay a chasm, requiring not only money, but a complete reevaluation of the logic of transportation. The idea of loading the trailer evolved into a system called intermodality. It's like blood circulation. The container is an erythrocyte that delivers oxygen or cargo from the lungs, the factory, to the cell, the recipient, without changing its form along the way. The cargo is sealed once at the factory and opened only at the warehouse. Between these points, it can travel by truck, train, and ship. This solved not only the problem of speed, but also theft. While everyone else was thinking about ships and cranes, McLean was thinking about flow. This was a revolution not in box design, but in the very logic of transportation, removing the most expensive and slowest element from the chain, port workers. To prove his point, McLean sold his thriving trucking company for $25 million. Today, that's the equivalent of over $280 million. He put everything on the line, but he never suspected that his main battle would not be with engineers, but with history. How was it that no one before McLean had thought of this simple idea? Similar boxes already existed on railways and in some local transport. This creates the illusion that McLean wasn't the first. But he understood what others didn't. The box itself was useless. A whole system was needed. 4 key elements had to work as a single mechanism: specially converted ships for transport, powerful port cranes for quick loading, standardized truck chassis for hauling them away, and the containers themselves, capable of withstanding multi-tier loads. McLean was the first to think not in terms of boxes, but of the entire infrastructure chain. He wasn't selling container shipping, but an integrated transport system. For this to work, a completely new world had to be built from scratch. The idea was there, money was on the line. But for his first experiment, he needed not blueprints, but old scrap metal from World War II. The idea was so grand it seemed insane. McLean didn't build new ships. He bought 2 decommissioned T2-class oil tankers, veterans of the Battle of the Atlantic, to convert them for container transport. The reaction of the maritime establishment was unequivocal, open mockery. Ship owners, port engineers, and union leaders called him the crazy truck driver, who understood nothing about the sea. They considered him an upstart, doomed to fail. But McLean ignored everyone. He named his first converted ship Ideal X. This name symbolized not just a vessel, but an ideal experiment. In April 1956, he was ready to prove to the world that they were wrong. Everything was at stake: his fortune, his reputation, and the future of global trade. D-Day was approaching. On April 26, 1956, the port of Newark was restless. All attention was focused on one unassuming vessel, an old tanker, on whose deck an awkward steel frame for 58 containers awkwardly rose. It didn't look like a ship of the future. A crowd of observers gathered, officials, competitors, and, most importantly, leaders of the dockworkers' union. They came not to applaud, but to await failure. At stake was not just McLean's reputation, but the fate of hundreds of thousands of jobs. These 58 boxes were poised either to make history or to bury their creator's dream. Everyone looked at the ship, but the real drama was unfolding not on the deck, but in the numbers on paper. Loading a similar volume of cargo manually would have taken several days and required an entire army of dockworkers. McLean's system handled it in 8 hours with a single crane crew. This was fast, but it wasn't what shocked observers. The real blow came from the numbers. The cost of loading 1 ton of cargo plummeted from $5.86 to less than 16 cents. This wasn't an improvement. It was an economic knockout, making the old system 36 times more expensive. This figure explains why one of the union leaders, seeing what was happening, exclaimed that he wished that damn ship would sink. It was an instant realization of a mortal threat. In Newark, the system worked, but ahead lay a 5-day journey to Houston, and the main test awaited. Arrival in Houston was no less important than departure. Trucks were already waiting at the dock, special chassis designed to transport containers. Port cranes just as quickly lifted the 58 boxes from the deck and placed them directly onto the wheels. The drivers immediately dispersed, delivering the cargo to the recipients' warehouses. There were no port warehouses, no transshipment, no theft. This was the first historical demonstration of the entire intermodal system in action. McLean proved that he had created not just a fast way to load, but a seamless transportation artery. The system worked like a zipper, connecting sea and land transport into one continuous process. The revolution proved its viability. But this success gave rise to a new, even more complex problem that could bury the entire idea. The success was astounding. McLean immediately ordered the construction of new, specialized container ships and began building the world's first container terminals. It seemed his company, Sealand, was on the verge of a monopoly. However, his main competitors, shipping giants Matson and Grace Line, seeing his triumph, rushed into the race. But instead of copying McLean's system, they began creating their own containers, different sizes, with different fastening systems. The world was heading towards a war of standards. A Sealand container didn't fit a Matson ship, and a Grace Line crane couldn't lift a Sealand box. For the revolution to become global, the whole world had to play by the same rules. This was no longer an engineering task, but a political one, an invention. Designed to unite the world risked dividing it. A new, invisible war for standards had begun. Why did the size of a metal box prove more important than the idea itself? Without a single standard, the container revolution was doomed. It would be a world with dozens of different electrical outlets or different railway gauges in neighboring countries. This creates barriers, not bridges. In the 1960s, the U.S. had 3 competing container standards. A port equipped for McLean's system couldn't service a competitor's ship. This was a technological dead end that turned a universal solution back into a specialized item, returning the industry to the chaos it was fleeing. For a global ocean of trade to even emerge, all its rivers had to consist of the same water. But getting mortal enemies to agree is almost impossible. This required the intervention of a force far more powerful than any corporation. This invisible war was fought in the stuffy offices of standardization committees, where lobbyists spent years defending their company's interests, delaying the process indefinitely. But while they argued, a solution came from the other side of the planet. Declassified Pentagon documents show that the escalation of the Vietnam War created a logistical catastrophe. The American military needed to supply a huge army through overloaded Asian ports. The old system couldn't cope. The Pentagon saw salvation in McLean's technology. The U.S. government signed gigantic contracts with his company, Sealand, for the transport of military cargo, effectively forcing his standard as the primary one. The Vietnam War, a tragedy for millions, became the main accelerator of a peaceful trade revolution. The Army made its choice. But for the standard to become global, an official international agreement was required. The battle ended between 1968 and 1970. The International Organization for Standardization, or ISO, finally adopted uniform sizes for containers, 20 and 40 feet, and even more importantly, a unified design for the corner fittings, which cranes used to lift them. At first glance, this seems like a boring technical solution. In reality, it was the birth of a universal language for global trade. Now, any container fit any ship, crane, or truck anywhere on the planet. The system became a kind of open source. McLean lost the chance for a monopoly, but his idea could now conquer the world. The technology was ready. A global language had been created, but standing in the way of progress were people for whom this language sounded like a death sentence. The technology was proven, the standard accepted. It seemed the path to dominance was open. Around the world, from Rotterdam to Singapore, giant container terminals began to be built. Shipping companies massively ordered new ships, but while engineers celebrated victory, despair grew on the docks. Standing in the way of this technological wave was the most organized and powerful force in ports, dockworker unions. For them, every container was a symbol of their impending unemployment. A battle was brewing, not for standards, but for the fates of hundreds of thousands of families. And it would be fought not in offices, but on the docks, with strikes, sabotage, and violence. The rebellion of humans against machines was beginning, and its outcome would determine the social cost of one of history's greatest revolutions. How could a simple metal box threaten one of the world's most powerful labor castes? Dockworkers controlled the arteries of the nation. Their union could paralyze the economy with a single decision. Their profession was not just a job, but a complex craft requiring strength and skill, and a worker's number in the port of New York was passed from father to son like a precious inheritance. Their power seemed absolute because their labor was irreplaceable. But the container system didn't just speed up their work, it made it obsolete. This wasn't about laying off some workers, but about eliminating 90% of jobs. The union's power was based on controlling the loading process, and the container made that very process outdated. For dock workers, this wasn't a battle for wages, but for the survival of an entire culture. But kings do not surrender their kingdoms without a fight. Their response was furious. And here is a paradox that defies logic. The more fiercely the unions fought for their rights, the faster their port fortresses turned into ghost towns. Their first tactic was obvious: make the implementation of containers unbearably painful. Mass strikes in the 60s and 70s shut down ports for weeks, generating colossal losses for ship owners. This was a proven strategy. But in ports with the strongest unions, like New York, they negotiated such huge compensation that processing a container there became many times more expensive than in neighboring ports. Businesses reacted instantly. Shipping lines simply began to bypass the expensive port fortresses. Their strategy worked like an attempt to build a dam at one point in a river. The higher they built a wall of costs, the faster global capital, like water, found other bypass channels. Their strength was their weakness, and this defeat forced them to understand technology cannot be defeated, but perhaps it can be taxed. The brutal confrontation suddenly ended. Why? Realizing the inevitable, union leaders shifted from a prohibit strategy to a sell strategy. They demanded lifetime guarantees for existing union members. Ship owners were willing to pay to buy peace in the ports, but reality proved far more ingenious. The parties created a container royalty, a permanent tax that ship owners paid to the union for every container passing through the port. In New York alone in the 70s, this tax brought in up to $30 million a year. This cash flow financed the pensions of those who agreed to leave for decades. The dock workers did the unthinkable. They sold their future jobs. They forced the killer technology itself to pay tribute to those it destroyed. And once this last human barrier was swept away, the real storm was just beginning. The war in the ports ended, and silence fell. But it was the calm before an economic storm. Now ship owners could confidently invest billions in giant cranes, new terminals, and enormous container ships. Ports rapidly transformed from crowded places into automated hubs. The system could finally operate at full capacity. The standard adopted years earlier was now supported by a workforce that no longer resisted. Containers flooded worldwide. This agreement removed three major barriers to global investment: the risk of strikes, cost uncertainty, and unpredictable timelines. The container ceased to be merely a box. It became the universal language of world trade, and this new operating system allowed it to crack the old code based on geography. The real reason your t-shirt is made in Vietnam and your phone in China lies precisely in this moment. Recall the numbers from the beginning of the film: $5.86 versus 16 cents. That's a 97% drop in shipping costs. What happens to the world when distance effectively ceases to have a price? Initially, ship owners thought this was just a way to reduce costs on old routes, but the reality proved far more radical. When transport costs fell to less than 1% of the total cost of a good, the primary factor in price became labor costs. In the 1970s, a worker's salary in the U.S. was 10 times higher than in South Korea or Taiwan. It became more profitable to produce goods on the other side of the world and ship them than to make them locally. A great disconnect occurred. The geography of production separated from the geography of consumption. The code of the world economy, which had operated for thousands of years, was cracked. And this launched the greatest migration in history. Only this time, it wasn't people migrating, but factories. What caused entire industrial regions in the West to empty out in a single decade? In the first phase, American and European companies simply relocated their entire factories to Asia to produce the same goods, but cheaper. This was offshoring. But the real revolution was deeper, the birth of the global supply chain. Previously, production was like a lake, where all processes were self-contained. The container transformed it into a global river system. Look at your smartphone. Its microchip is made in Taiwan, the display in South Korea, the battery in China, and the design conceived in the U.S. The container became the circulatory system of this new economy, a standardized module that allows different countries to be parts of one giant global assembly line. Look at the tag on your clothes. Most likely the country of manufacture is thousands of miles away from you. Have you ever wondered how this became possible? Almost every item in your room once traveled in a standard metal box. The abundance on supermarket shelves, coffee from Colombia, clothes from Bangladesh, toys from China, televisions from South Korea, all are a direct consequence of cheap logistics. We take this world for granted, but behind it lies an invisible infrastructure. Modern ports are unpeopled spaces where giant ships, the size of skyscrapers, carrying 24,000 containers, are unloaded by robotic cranes 24 hours a day. One such ship carries enough goods to fill 500 average supermarkets in a single voyage. Our consumer world stands on the shoulders of this unnoticed hero. Malcom McLean's revolution changed the world beyond recognition. But the system that gave us all this abundance proved to be incredibly fragile. The truck driver's dream of perfect efficiency came true on a scale he could never have imagined. The world became unified, fast, and interconnected. It was a triumph. Global logistics worked like clockwork. Goods flowed in a continuous stream, but every degree of efficiency came at the cost of a degree of resilience. This system had no margin of safety. It was built for ideal conditions. In March 2021, the Ever Given vessel blocked the Suez Canal for just 6 days. One ship in one narrow choke point halted the movement of goods worth approximately $9.5 billion daily, causing a collapse in global supplies. The legacy of the container is not only efficiency but also fragility. We built a marvel of engineering, but we made ourselves its hostages. So, what was this invention to our world? To answer, we must piece together all parts of this story. Now that all the pieces are on the table, we see that this was not a story of one invention, but a chain of 6 inevitable steps. It all began with unbearable port chaos. This pain gave rise to a truck driver's ingenious insight. His risky experiment with the Ideal X proved the idea worked, but immediately uncovered a new problem: locality. This was resolved through a long war for a standard, which turned the box into a universal language. But this technological solution encountered a human barrier, the dockworkers' rebellion. And only when this last barrier was sold and swept away could the system unleash the explosion of globalization. These 6 steps formed an unbreakable chain of cause and effect. This logic explains how the revolution occurred, but it does not answer the mysteries we posed at the very beginning. Let's return to them. Why did giant ports like New York lose first? Because their most powerful unions, by winning the battle for compensation, made their ports the most expensive in the world. Global capital, having gained mobility thanks to the container, simply bypassed them. Like a river bypassing an overly expensive dam, their strength became their weakness. And the second mystery: why did the unions agree to the destruction of their profession? This was not capitulation. It was a cold bargain. They exchanged a future that no longer belonged to them for a guaranteed and prosperous present. Through a tax on each container, they forced the killer technology to pay tribute to those it destroyed. In both cases, local power lost its clash with global economic force, for which the container became the ideal weapon. This brings us to Malcom McLean's dual legacy. On one hand, his genius made the world more accessible to billions. In the 30 years after the introduction of containers, The volume of global trade grew more than fivefold, lifting hundreds of millions out of poverty. This is the world of abundance we see on store shelves. But there is also a dark side. His invention triggered the Great Migration of factories, destroying not only dockworkers' jobs but millions of manufacturing jobs in the West. In the U.S. alone, over 5 million manufacturing jobs were lost between 1980 and 2010. And finally, the legacy of fragility. The hyper-efficient system he created lacks resilience, as proven by the Ever Given incident. Look around you. Every imported item in your room is an argument for McLean. But if you or your loved ones lost jobs due to manufacturing relocation, that's an argument against. So, who was he? A genius who cracked the code of the global economy, made the world richer and connected. Continents? Or a destroyer whose invention devastated industrial centers in the West and made our civilization dangerously dependent on fragile supply chains? Your opinion is the final element of this story. Write just one word in the comments, hero or destroyer. Let's see whose view of history prevails today.